1. Number without exit. Michael and Lisa, a young couple, went on a trip to the southern states of the United States, deciding to explore quieter places outside the big cities. Tired of endless hours behind the wheel, they eventually end up at the small, little-known Sunny Days Motel, located on a remote highway in Texas. On the outside, the motel looked abandoned, but it was a great alternative for an overnight stay after a long road. As soon as they got out of the car and approached the building, they were surprised by how the motel looked abandoned and gloomy. The sign was dull, and there were old cars on the asphalt, only one or two of which looked like they belonged to guests. All this, however, did not stop them. They were exhausted and just wanted to rest. "This motel looks like something from a horror movie," Lisa said as she looked at the building. "Don't be dramatic, we're just over the night," Michael reassured her. An old man, Henry, was sitting at the registration desk. His gray hair was disordered, and his face was covered with deep wrinkles. He smiled when he saw Michael and Lisa and pointed to the number 13. "The keys to your room," he said without adding more words. "The night will be quiet. Everything will be fine." Michael looked at him in surprise. Why number 13? But against the background of fatigue and desire to sleep, he did not ask. They thanked Henry and went to their room. The room was small and dark. The ceiling was low, the furniture was outdated, and the window was clogged with a board. Lisa immediately noticed the unpleasant smell of old wood and dust filling the room. She walked to the window, trying to open it, but without success. "No one has clearly been cleaning up here for a long time," she said, moving away from the window and taking off her jacket. "Yes, it looks like this place hasn't been renovated for a long time," Michael agreed, already sitting on the bed. They quickly settled down and went to bed to recover. But as soon as Michael fell asleep, he felt himself wake up again and again from the strange noise. It was like a distant step echoing through the corridor. At first, he tried to ignore it, thinking it was just an old house creaking. But the sounds became clearer. Footsteps approached the door of their room. Michael woke up completely, and his heart began to pound with fear. He quietly returned to Lisa to see if she could hear the same thing. Lisa slept, not knowing what was happening. Michael stood up and walked to the door cautiously, trying to figure out what those sounds were. He looked through the small window in the door. When his gaze struck the dark corridor, he saw the silhouette. It was a man who stood right in front of their door. Michael's eyes widened with horror. The figure looked strange. Her face was unnaturally pale and vague, and her mouth was slanted in a creepy smile. Michael immediately jumped off the door, feeling fear engulfing him with a whole wave. "Lisa, wake up!" he shouted, trying to stay calm. Lisa opened her eyes, but Michael was already so scared that he couldn't explain exactly what had happened. The footsteps approaching their door stopped, but he felt that someone invisible was watching him. He decided to act quickly. He grabbed Lisa's hand and broke out of the room, but the door did not give in. A few seconds, and Michael pulled the handle with all his strength, but nothing happened. Then he noticed that he heard those terrible footsteps approaching from the other end of the corridor again. What's going on? Lisa barely held on her feet with fright. With no other choice, they ran out through a window that was clogged with a wooden board window. They came down to the ground and ran to the exit of the motel without even looking back. In the morning, in search of an answer, Michael and Lisa returned to the reception. Henry sat in his seat and, without raising his eyes, said softly, "Number 13? But no one has stopped there for a long time." Michael couldn't understand why their number was the 13th. He looked at the registration books and saw that their number did not exist on the registered list. "We booked room 13 over the phone, but it doesn't appear on the system," Michael said. Henry looked at him again. His eyes were completely empty. "Do you really want to know?" he asked softly. Before they could answer, Henry turned away and began to write something in the registration book. And yet Michael and Lisa realized that there are things that are better not to ask. 2. Mysterious calls. Susan has always chosen inexpensive motels for her travels without placing high demands on comfort. She was used to the fact that this is only a stage necessary in order to spend the night quickly and without unnecessary costs before the next stage of the journey. But everything changed when she stayed at the Crossroads Inn Motel on the road between Kansas City and St. Louis. This motel was not like the others she had visited before. It stood in the very heart of the night landscape, away from any major cities, on an abandoned part of the road that was almost unused. The motel looked like an old hotel from the 60s, with a peeled sign and shabby doors. At dusk, he looked quite calm, but Susan felt a strange tension in the air as she drove past his old walls. She arrived at night and was very tired after a long day driving. It was her first time on this track, and she didn't want to stay at more expensive hotels, so she decided to stay at the Crossroads Inn. She quickly went to the registration, where she was met by an old woman with glasses, with a tired expression. "Are you staying for the night?" she asked. Susan nodded and got the key to number 7. "This room is at the end of the corridor on the second floor," the woman said, not taking her eyes off the magazine. Susan thanked and headed to the elevator. The room was simple. One bed, an old TV, and a table by the window, through which you could see the dark outlines of abandoned buildings on the other side of the street. But what struck Susan the most was that the room looked completely deserted. There was no sign that someone had recently been here. The room was quiet, and after a few minutes, when Susan lay down on the bed and turned off the light, there was absolute silence around. But it was at this moment that her phone suddenly rang. Looking at the screen, she saw an unfamiliar number. "Hello?" she replied, trying to figure out who it could be. Silence. Then, at the other end of the line, there was a barely audible voice. "Don't go to the bathroom," he said and hung up. Susan squeezed the phone, not knowing if it was a joke or some kind of wrong connection. She tried to call back again, but the number was not available. An anxious mood grew in her heart, but she decided not to pay attention to these little things. In the end, it could just be the wrong call. But the next morning, waking up from the strange feeling that someone was standing nearby, Susan noticed that the door of her room was open, although she was sure that she was closing it before going to bed. Stepping on the carpet, she went to the bathroom, trying to make sure everything was okay. There was no one there, but the atmosphere seemed strange. The sharp smell of dampness and dust was so distinct that Susan began to suspect that someone or something was in the room. The footsteps were heard again, but now they were no longer heard from the corridor, but from the middle of the motel. Susan grabbed the phone, trying to call the registration, but the line was busy. And here again is the call. Unknown number. Susan's heart began to beat faster. She answered, trying to stay calm. "I see you €1, the voice whispered, and this time it was clearer. Susan tried to pull herself together, but even her voice trembled. "Who are you? What do you need?" she shouted, trying to drive fear out of herself. No one answered. The echo of her words simply disappeared into the silence that filled the room. Something was wrong. She picked up the phone and called the registration again. It has already become a real nightmare. But no one answered. The silence was felt more and more in the room, and her legs were shaking. In the end, she decided to act. After running out of the room, Susan ran to the exit, grabbing her things. She ran to the door and tried to get out, but it didn't open. The castle did not give in. She could only hope that at the other end of the motel someone would hear her. In her head began to arise disturbing thoughts about what kind of motel it was, why she could not find any information about it on the internet. Susan tried to knock on the door, but it was all in vain. When the door finally opened, a woman stood in front of her. She was wearing an old robe and looking at Susan as if nothing had happened. "Do you want to leave the room?" the woman asked in a cold voice. Susan couldn't say a word. The room was so dark that she couldn't even see this person's face. However, looking into the darkness, she noticed that even the walls seemed a little too advanced, as if they were trying to bring her back into the motel's maze. The woman opened the door silently, and Susan ran out without looking back. When she turned to the administration the next day for clarification, she was told that number 7 was not registered, and calls from unfamiliar numbers were not recorded in the system. In addition, there were no records of Susan in their system either. And only later did Susan learn from the locals that the Crossroads and Motel had long been closed due to several incomprehensible incidents, and that strange and mysterious events had once occurred there. It turns out that this place has become almost a legend among those who traveled this route. 3. Overnight at a motel on the old road. Chris and Emily traveled through the southern states of the United States. They went on a trip to visit several national parks and enjoy nature, as well as escape from the stress of everyday life. However, after a few hours driving on deserted roads, where there were neither people nor any big cities, they began to feel tired and desperate. They couldn't find an overnight stay, and there were no other motels on the road. And when they thought they couldn't stand it anymore, a small motel appeared, Hollow Creek Inn, which stood on a lonely road that twisted through the mountains. The motel was old and looked like something from the 60s, with a darkened sign, an old door, and no modern signs of civilization around it. But they were already so tired that they didn't even think about stopping or not. Chris braked the car, and they went outside. There was a faint smell of dampness from the motel, but nothing that could scare them away. However, they did not know that this would be their last night in a normal world. They entered the lobby, where they were met by a female figure. The young woman, dressed in an old-fashioned dress, was behind the counter and smiled as if it was her only occupation. There was something uncertain and almost ghostly in her eyes. She gave Chris and Emily the keys to number 9, saying that it was the only available number. You can leave your things in the room and go to the restaurant if you want. There are not many guests here, but we are happy to welcome you, she said. Chris looked at Emily and nodded. They thanked and went to their room. The room was dark and cold, with heavy curtains that did not let even the slightest light through. There was an old cover on the bed that looked like she remembered a few more decades. The furniture was no better than anything else in this motel, but they didn't mind. They just wanted to rest. As soon as they put down their things and lay down on the beds, the feeling of anxiety began to slowly penetrate their minds. And at first they couldn't even figure out what was causing this feeling. The silence in the room was strange. Chris, in his habit, checked the window and the door to make sure everything was okay. But when he returned to bed, he noticed that the darkness had become thicker. "What's the matter with this motel?" Emily asked. Her voice sounded a little nervous. "It's just an old house," Chris said. "There's nothing to worry about. We're just tired." But the next night this "nothing to worry" became a reality. As soon as they closed their eyes and calmed down, they heard the first sound, very faint, like the knock of something heavy falling to the floor. Then this sound was repeated, and even in the dark, Chris could clearly distinguish his direction. He was walking from under the bed. Emily didn't believe it at first, but when the sound became louder and louder, she raised her head. "Do you hear that?" she asked, squeezing his hand. Chris nodded, but instead of reaching the source of the sound, he remained in place. He felt his heart pounding in his chest. "Don't pay attention to it. This is an old house. It could just be something that squeaks or moves," he said, although deep down he began to doubt. However, the next sound was even louder. It was like a very heavy breathing, which gradually gained momentum. Emily grabbed his hand. "What is this?" Her voice trembled with fear. Chris slowly got out of bed and gently walked to the wall where he seemed to hear a sound. He knelt down and tried to look under the bed. His eyes got used to the darkness, and he saw what he should not have seen. There was nothing under the bed, but when he turned back, he saw a dark figure standing in the corner of the room, right behind them. They froze with fear. It was a woman, but she didn't move and was completely silent. Chris, clenching his fists, tried to shout something, but at that moment the figure disappeared as quickly as it appeared. "Did you see it?" he asked, addressing Emily, though his voice was barely audible. She just nodded, unable to say a word. They ran, without looking back as soon as possible. Chris and Emily ran out of the room, leaving their belongings. When they reached the corridor, the door of their room suddenly closed behind them with such a rumble that it seemed as if someone or something had locked them inside. Chris grabbed the doorknob, but she didn't give in. His hands trembled as he pulled the door, but they remained unmoved. What to do? Emily asked. Her voice sounded like she had already forgotten how to breathe. Chris tried to open the door again, trying to understand what was happening. All the other rooms on this floor were dark, and everything around was incredibly quiet, as if even the walls of the motel themselves held this horrible secret. "We have to get out of here," said Chris, his heart beating like a phrase, and there was only one thought in his head: to get out of this motel as soon as possible. They ran to the stairs, going down, trying not to make noise. But the footsteps sounded so loud that it seemed as if the entire motel could hear them. They reached the hall, but the motel was completely empty. No one met them. Not a single living soul was in sight. Surprisingly, the woman at the reception disappeared, like all the other employees. The motel was kind of abandoned, although a few hours ago it was a perfectly normal place to stay. Suddenly, the back door of the hall opened with a strange squeak, and in the dark they saw silhouettes of several figures approaching them. Their shadows moved slowly, silently, and although they seemed completely unnatural, Chris and Emily couldn't look away. They were people, or something like people, but their faces were pale, with empty eyes, having neither soul nor life. They didn't speak, but their movements were as if they knew what would happen next. "Who are you?" Emily said with a faint fear in her voice. One of the silhouettes approached and reached out to them, but his fingers were as long as those of a mannequin, and a shadow stretched from them, as if absorbing everything around. "You shouldn't be here," this silhouette whispered, and his voice sounded as if it came from another time, from another world. "This motel is a trap." Susan couldn't understand what it meant, but she felt her heart freeze. It was not something that could be explained rationally. She saw the other figures starting to move towards them, and realized that she couldn't wait any longer. "We have to get out," Chris exclaimed, pulling her hand. They rushed to the exit as much as they could, passing empty rooms and corridors that seemed to lead them further and further away from reality. The walls of the motel became narrower, the doors in front of them remained closed, and everything seemed to be locked in time. They ran until they found themselves on the stairs, where the shadow was increasingly shaping approaching people. And although Chris and Emily made the last leap to the exit, they realized that the motel was not just a place to stay overnight. It wasn't just a building. It was a portal to the dark and the unknown, where time and space were interrupted. Finally, they ran outside, but there was no sound behind them. No steps, no voices. They found themselves in the night air, and the motel was left behind them. They looked back for a moment, but the motel no longer looked the same as it was a few minutes ago. Now it looked completely abandoned, like a ruin that did not exist in the real world. Chris and Emily couldn't explain what happened, but they knew one thing. They just avoided something that couldn't be understood. The sky above them looked unusually dark, and the moon was covered with clouds in the distance. Did you see it?" Chris asked, his voice hoarse. "Yes," Emily replied, her eyes wide open with horror. "But now we are alive. We are on the street again." They could no longer stay in that place, and without saying a word, they got into the car, moving towards the nearest city without looking back. And although their journey continued, they never forgot the Hollow Creek Inn Motel, and the night they experienced all the terrible reality of this place. The motel on the old road was no longer what it seemed at first glance. It was a home to the dark forces hunting those who mistakenly stop, not knowing that they were involved in something more terrible than they can imagine. 4. Overnight at the Redwood Pines Motel. Jackson and Liz were a young couple who went on vacation to enjoy a break from the everyday life of the city. They planned to drive through California, see national parks, and, of course, stay in different motels along the way. The Redwood Pines Motel was their last stop on the way, and they couldn't wait to finally relax after a long day on the road. This motel was located near the forest, among tall red trees, and although it was late in the evening, the place looked quite cozy. The motel sign was bright, and a large lantern illuminated the entrance. The motel looked like an old wooden house that looked like it had been in this place for a long time. But Jackson and Liz did not pay attention to these details. They were tired, and their main desire was just to book a room and go to bed. The friendly woman at the reception took them warmly and quickly registered them. "Number 3, she said, passing the key to them. "It's on the second floor. Dinner is over, but we have some snacks in the hall if you want." Liz nodded, and they went up the stairs to their room. As soon as they entered the room, they noticed that it looked a little old-fashioned, but cozy. A low dark wood floor, old furniture, and a large window through which a dark forest was visible. Jackson walked to the window, looking out into the darkness of the night. "It looks so calm," he said, sighing. "You can really relax here." They put their things away and lay down on the bed, enjoying the silence. But as soon as Jackson began to fall asleep, Liz felt some kind of uncertainty that was difficult to explain. She turned to him, and there was a hint of concern in her voice. "Do you hear that?" she asked, trying to look into the darkness. "What?" Jackson asked, a little surprised. Liz pulled on the quilt, as if trying to protect her. "This sound is like something or someone wandering under a window." Jackson listened attentively, but heard nothing. He decided that it was probably just her fatigue, and closed his eyes, trying to fall asleep. But after a few minutes, Liz felt restless again. Something was wrong. She got up from the bed and walked to the window. What she saw made her heart turn. There was something on the outside of the window that resembled blurred shadows moving slowly between the trees. They didn't look like people, more like incomprehensible silhouettes that disappeared and reappeared. Liz could feel her heart beating in her throat. She quickly sneaked away from the window and turned to Jackson. "Jackson, there's someone there," she whispered, holding his hand. Jackson opened his eyes and sat on the bed, turning his head towards the window. But what Liz saw, he didn't see. Everything was calm. "You must be just tired," he reassured her. However, Liz couldn't forget what she saw. She tried to relax, but she couldn't. And even when Jackson fell asleep, she couldn't get rid of the feeling that someone was watching her from the darkness. The night dragged on for a very long time, and even when the morning came, Liz couldn't get rid of that feeling. She went out to the balcony and looked at the forest, but she didn't notice anything unusual. During breakfast in the hall, Jackson asked the woman at the reception about the surrounding area, and she told them a strange story. This forest was the place where many years ago several strange cases of disappearance of people were detected, she said. Some people say they heard strange sounds or saw shadows moving between the trees. No one could explain it. Liz began to look nervously at Jackson, and he was not sure how to react to this story. He tried to brush it off, thinking that it was just old myths, but it became heavy on his heart. After breakfast, they went for a walk in the woods, although they felt a little uncertain. Liz tried to calm herself down, but she couldn't get rid of the feeling that something was watching them. They walked among the huge trees, and the deeper they went into the forest, the more it seemed to them that every step echoed with an unusual echo. At that moment, Liz heard the soft whispers again, which sounded as if they were heard from all sides. She looked around, but saw no one. Her heart was pounding. Jackson, noticing her tension, stopped and asked, "What's wrong with you? Don't you hear that?" she asked, trying to look around. Again, those shadows that appeared among the trees. Now they began to move faster, and it seemed that they were getting closer to them. "We have to go back," Jackson said, trying to stay calm. He took Liz's hand and pulled her back to the motel. When they returned to their room, the door was closed and the lock on them was unusual. They entered, and at that moment they both heard strange sounds coming from outside. It was as if someone was standing at their door and whispering softly. Liz ran to the window and saw the dark silhouettes wandering among the trees again. "We can't stay here," she said with horror in her voice. They immediately packed their belongings and ran out of the room without turning around. Coming out through the back exit, they ran to the car, quickly got on and left this motel without looking back. After that night, Jackson and Liz were unable to explain what exactly happened at the Redwood Pines Motel. They heard from the locals that this motel was built on the site of an old Indian cemetery, and local legends tell that the forest around it is home to spirits who do not let go of those who fall on this land. Wherever they went after that, the Redwood Pines Motel remained in their minds. They never returned to this road, and although they tried to find a reasonable explanation. 5. Motel, Whispering Pines. Mary and her younger brother John were on their way to New Orleans when their car suddenly broke down. They were far from any major cities or car services and, forced to seek a temporary shelter, stopped at the small motel, Whispering Pines, which stood on the side of the road. The appearance of this place was a little strange. It resembled the motels of the old days, when travelers stopped for the night to rest before the long journey. The motel was made of wood, the windows were old and foggy, and several tall pines grew in the yard, which seemed to spread a slight rustle throughout the house, like a whisper. Whispering Pines Motel, a place to rest, was written on the motel sign. Mary and John didn't pay attention to this. They were exhausted after a long day on the road and were in a hurry to find a place to stay overnight. The friendly old man at the reception greeted them and quickly registered. "Number 4, he said. "You may want to rest for a while before moving on. The evening is calm, and the local pines can be adjusted in the right way." Mary nodded, but deep down she felt a strange anxiety. The motel looked like a place where nothing had changed since the 70s, and it seemed that this old man was the only inhabitant of that place. Their room was small but clean, with old furniture, thick glass windows, and the smell of tobacco in the air. John immediately went to bed, taking off his shoes, but Mary, sitting on the edge of the bed, began to examine the room. In the corner by the window there was an antique lamp with a dark lampshade that seemed to have been turned on recently. Mary noticed several old paintings on the walls. All of them depicted natural landscapes and incredibly realistic portraits, as if imprinted in time. However, one of the paintings attracted her attention in particular. It was a portrait of a man with a deep look. His eyes seemed alive, and Mary felt a strange cold pass through her skin as she looked at him. "What's up with this picture?" she asked, feeling her heart start to beat faster. "It's just an old drawing," John replied, barely standing up. "It may be part of what makes this motel so old." Mary did not answer, but felt that the painting did not give her peace. It seemed that the man in the picture seemed to be watching their every move. She decided not to dwell on it and took her book, trying to relax. However, the next morning, when they were preparing to leave the motel and continue their journey, strange things began. From the very morning there was an incredible silence in the motel. Mary and John didn't meet anyone except the old man at the reception. There was no one on the territory of the motel, not even in the parking lot. They went to the forest surrounding the motel to take a walk and relax, but the forest seemed unusually quiet. Only in some places did the rustle of leaves underfoot break this absolute silence. John felt a little uncomfortable, but Mary decided it was just their fatigue after the road. They went back to the motel, and when they returned to the room, something unexpected happened. All the doors were locked, but not on the side where they were left. The room was closed, and the key to it did not fit. Mary began to get nervous and walked to the reception again. The old man who was standing behind the counter looked at them with something like pleasure on his face. He was silent until Mary asked, "What happened? Why is the door locked?" "You must have just mixed up the time," he replied coldly. "Your room, number 4, has long been closed. No one should have opened it." Mary and John looked at each other, not understanding what was happening. They mentioned that last night the room was open, and even if it was a registration error, they could not be wrong at such an important moment. But we booked room 4, insisted Mary. The man just shrugged his shoulders, as if it didn't matter. Will you stay here a little longer? We can find you another number, he said, returning to the old registration log. They decided not to delay and left without waiting for the old man to take them to the motel again. The car was moving towards the road, but the further they drove away from the motel, the more anxiety sensation overwhelmed Mary. She turned around, and although the motel seemed smaller and smaller in the rearview mirror, she thought the windows on the top floor were glowing. The shadows dancing outside the windows seemed to be waiting for their return. John noticed that he also felt uncomfortable, and when he turned to Mary, his face looked like someone who had experienced something very strange. Did you feel it? He asked with anxiety in his voice. Yes, Mary replied, unable to say more. She couldn't forget this motel and what happened. There was no doubt that Whispering Pines was not just a motel. Driving a few miles, Mary and John remembered an old photo they saw in the motel rooms, which depicted the same building, but with other people standing in front of it. However, one man in the photo was surprisingly familiar. His face resembled the old man at the reception. Although it was impossible, he looked too young. There was a fear in Mary's head that they were not just witnessing a strange situation, but perhaps even becoming part of something much scarier. And although they didn't know exactly what happened in the Whispering Pines, they never went this road again and tried to forget about the motel that whispered its secret between the branches of the pine trees. 6. Overnight at the Pines Hollow. Sharon and her husband Michael embarked on a journey through the southern states of the United States. They planned to make a steep route along the west coast, but when they had to travel through a slightly remote area of Texas, they found themselves in an unexpected situation. Their car broke down in the middle of the road, far from the nearest service. The night on the horizon was rapidly approaching, and they were forced to seek refuge. Fortunately, a few miles later they saw an old motel standing in the middle of a field surrounded by a forest. The Pines Hollow Motel, a place for rest. The motel looked old-fashioned, but differed favorably from other establishments located along this deserted path. In addition, it was the only motel for many miles around, and Sharon had no choice. They entered the motel grounds, and although the area seemed neglected, the house itself looked relatively neat. The building was two-story, with dirty windows and dimly lit lanterns, which created a certain gloomy atmosphere. When they entered the reception, they were met by a middle-aged woman with a pale face holding an old registration book. She smiled kindly, but this smile was a little too restrained. "Good evening, do you need a number?" she asked with a vague accent, sliding her gaze over their faces. Sharon tensed up a little, but replied, "Yes, please. We just want to rest and continue our journey tomorrow." The woman quickly registered them, giving the key to number 7. "The room is at the end of the corridor. Don't worry, it's calm here. You'll feel at home." Sharon and Michael thanked and went to their room. The key was old, made of metal with some ancient number, which clearly indicated the age of the motel. As soon as they entered the room, they were greeted by old furniture. A yellow carpet on which it was already difficult to see the original drawing, a large bed with thick blankets, and an old TV that did not work. The windows of the room were covered with a thick layer of dust, which Sharon believed added an even more strange look to this place. "Well, at least we have a place to sleep," she said, trying to stay optimistic. Michael sat on the bed and fell asleep quickly, but Sharon couldn't get rid of the feeling that something was wrong. She sat down on a chair and began to examine the room when an old painting hanging on the wall in front of her caught her attention. It was a portrait of a married couple, a man and a woman who looked very similar to the locals. However, the faces were very pale, and the expressions looked restless, like those of people who had just experienced some tragic event. Sharon felt the cold running through her skin and looked away. She looked at her watch. It was too late, and she decided that she should go to bed. However, as soon as she opened her eyes, she began to hear strange sounds coming from the corridor. At first it was just a quiet rustle, similar to the crunch of an old tree, and then a clear step approaching. Sharon lay motionless, listening to these steps, and her heart began to beat faster. The steps stopped at their door. Silence. Then, very gently, a soft whisper began, as if someone was talking through the door. Sharon felt her heart stint. She dived under the quilt, trying not to move, but the fear did not let her go. Meanwhile, Michael was asleep and didn't hear those sounds. Sharon decided that it must be her imagination, and after a few minutes, she still fell asleep. In the morning, when she woke up, nothing unusual happened. However, Sharon noticed one thing. When they came out of the room to eat breakfast, all the doors were closed, and on the door of each room there were old rings for locks that were not there before. She decided not to ask about it, and they ate at the reception, where she was served old-fashioned dishes that looked like they had come from the 50s. When they hit the road, Sharon looked back at the motel and noticed that the windows were still closed on its upper floor, and the motel looked too quiet. She felt even more uncomfortable, although they were no longer inside. However, the biggest impression was the night meeting they had later that day when they drove past this MOT again. Motel. As they drove past the Pines Hollow Motel, Sharon looked at it again through the car window, and this time it seemed to her that the motel looked completely different. The windows on the second floor, which previously seemed closed, were now transparent and shone with the light, as if someone had turned on the interior lighting. But how could it be? They had just left the motel and saw that the windows were covered with dust and looked abandoned. Sharon turned to Michael excitedly. "Do you see it?" she asked, her voice trembling. Michael, not knowing what she meant at first, glanced at the motel. "What do you mean? There is nothing special there. It's just a motel." But Sharon was stubborn. She looked at the building intently, her heart beating faster. "Something is wrong here. Michael, I'm sure the windows were closed when we were leaving. You didn't notice?" Michael glanced at the motel again, and then quickly shifted his gaze to the road. "You must be tired, Sharon. Maybe it's just your imagination. The real problem is that we forgot to refuel, and we need to get to the nearest gas station." Sharon decided not to argue and continue on her way, but the motel remained in her mind. All these strange sounds, this alarm at night. She couldn't forget about them. This place did not give her peace. A few days later, after they had already driven several hundred miles, Sharon recalled one interesting moment that had occurred in the motel that she could not explain. When she came to the reception, after they returned the key to the room, the woman working at the counter looked at her with a worried look. "Are you feeling well?" she asked. "Yes. Why are you asking?" Sharon replied, not understanding. "Nothing," the woman said, but her voice seemed nervous. "Just be careful. There is something in this motel that cannot be explained. Sometimes the people who stay here stay with us forever." Sharon didn't understand what it meant at the time, but now, as she was rethinking everything that had happened, it became clear to her that these words were not accidental. They sounded like a warning. After Sharon and Michael returned home, everything seemed to be fine. They forgot about the motel and returned to normal life. But a week later, when Sharon interrupted old photos, in one of the photos she saw something that at first glance seemed completely ordinary. It was one of the photos taken in the motel. She was just standing there in front of the counter, holding the key to the room. But in the background, near the window, there was a vague image of a dark figure. Man? Ghost? Sharon Frost, looking at this photo. It was the same woman at the reception, but behind her was this dark figure. Sharon didn't know if it was just an optical effect or something more, but she couldn't get rid of the feeling that that motel and its residents had some hidden dark story. And it was this story that now invisibly continued to haunt her even in everyday life. Now that she closed her eyes, Sharon heard a strange whisper. The echo of the voice she heard that night in the motel resounded in her head, and it seemed that it was getting closer and closer, as if she was overtaken by the very essence of the motel, and she could not get rid of the feeling that something dark and invisible would not leave her alone. This thought haunted Sharon both at night and during the day. She could no longer sleep peacefully, and although the motel, the Pines Hollow, remained far behind, something in this place remained with her for a long time, a dark shadow that sneaked into her dreams. Sometimes, when she looked out the window, it seemed to her that something was moving behind her back, footsteps approaching from the other side of her room. And although she knew that it was only her imagination, this anxiety did not disappear, leaving the feeling that the dark force was still nearby. 7. Shadow's Edge Motel. Lisa has always loved to travel alone. She often went on trips to take a break from the noise of city life, be alone and relax in silence, away from people. This time, its route ran through the mountainous regions of Colorado. She planned to spend a few days in one of the famous national parks, but found that the road was longer than she expected. One evening, when the sun was setting over the horizon, Lisa realized that she would not have enough time to get to the nearest big city. She was essentially among the mountains, and the only place she met on her way was the old Shadow's Edge Motel. It seemed that he appeared somehow suddenly, and even the title itself, The Edge of the Shadow, seemed to Lisa somehow overly dramatic. But there was no other choice. The motel was large, similar to a two-story building made of dark wood, with a neglected view. In front of him was a large park area, on which there were several old cars that seemed to have been moving for a long time. Lisa parked her car outside the reception and went inside. On the rack stood an elderly man, tall and thin, with a pale face and very deep wrinkles. He looked at Lisa with some indifference, but she noticed something strange in his eyes, observant, but without any warmth. He didn't greet her, just said softly, "Do you have a room for one night?" Lisa nodded and asked for the key to the nearest number. The man handed her an old metal key that said, "Number 12. The end of the corridor," he added dryly. Lisa thanked and went to the room. She didn't like this place from the beginning. The corridor was poorly lit, and there was a strange, heavy silence around. The ceiling in the room was low, and the furniture was old and scratched. The bed was covered with a heavy dark blanket, and on the wall hung a picture of an incomprehensible landscape. A dark sky with only the shadow of a tree similar to an age-old spruce. She couldn't explain why, but the painting made Lisa anxious. Of course, she decided not to dwell on it and just went to rest. Her plan was simple, to sleep for a few hours and continue the journey in the morning. But immediately after she fell asleep, unusual sounds began. At first it was a soft squeak, similar to the footsteps echoing from the corridor, then a rustling, as if someone was dragging a heavy object on the floor. Lisa opened her eyes and listened. It seems that there was nothing, but her feeling did not leave. She thought it was just her imagination and tried to fall asleep again. But in the morning when she woke up, something very strange happened. All her things were moved. As soon as Lisa got out of bed, she noticed that her bag was open, and a few items she left on the table moved to another place. She was surprised, but didn't attach much importance to it. Maybe she just didn't notice how she transferred things, or it was done by the staff who come to clean up. But it seemed strange, because Lisa didn't leave the room in the evening, and the door was locked. After leaving the room, she approached the reception, where the same elderly man was standing behind the counter. He didn't say a word, just gave her the bill for the overnight stay. Lisa decided to ask him about the strange sounds, but he only shrugged his shoulders. "Everything happens in a motel," he replied. "There hasn't been a repair here for a long time." Lisa felt that this man was hiding something, but she didn't focus on it. She quickly walked out of the motel and got into the car, hoping that this night would soon be over. But the further she drove, the more she felt that something was wrong. The question was swirling in her head. Why was the motel so separate, and also why did her things move? What kind of motel is this? which was as if sunk in the shade, and where the presence of something unexplained was felt. On the way to the next gas station, as Lisa drove past several other motels, she realized that she had never seen the Shadow's Edge Motel again. The road was empty, and this motel was not on any map. It was a small, almost inconspicuous building that suddenly appeared and then disappeared when it was left behind. In the middle of the day, Lisa went to the nearest town to fill up the car and rest. At the gas station, she shared her experience with the locals. Everyone who heard her just looked at her with surprise. "Shadow's Edge Motel?" asked one of the men, who looked like a local. "Girl, there is no such place. This is a forgotten place, long abandoned and closed. There have been no motels or businesses for more than 10 years. Lisa felt panic over her. She remembers exactly how she went there last night. All the details were clear and everything seemed real, but now she realized that this place may have been just out of this world. Since then, Lisa has been unable to get rid of the feeling that Shadow's Edge Motel was more than just a hotel for travelers. And even when she passed by the places where this motel was supposed to be, there were no more traces or mentions of it, as if he did not even exist, and remained only in her memories. She has never been able to figure out what really happened that night, but now, every time she travels, she looks cautiously at remote, abandoned motels, whose signs seem familiar, but mysteriously disappear as she approaches them.